My husband told me to stay away from his family estate on Christmas Eve. He casually mentioned that his ex-wife was going to be there, and his mother wanted his son to experience a flawless holiday without my awkward presence ruining the aesthetic. So I stayed behind in our quiet home. But just after 1 in the morning, my phone lit up. It was my husband, and his arrogant voice was shaking with absolute terror as he screamed, asking why I did this to him. My name is Melanie. I am 34 years old, and my husband had no idea who he was actually married to. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a partner underestimate your intelligence and mistake your patience for weakness. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled our Chicago townhouse, a sharp contrast to the freezing tension radiating from the master bedroom. It was 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve, and my husband Carter was aggressively stuffing cashmere sweaters into his designer luggage. I stood leaning against the doorframe, watching him meticulously fold a velvet scarf I had bought him for our anniversary. He did not even look up at me. He just kept packing his jaw set in that stubborn line he always used when he was about to deliver bad news. "I am not trying to be the bad guy here, Melanie," he said, finally zipping the bag shut with a sharp tug. "My mother just thinks it is best if you sit this one out. Monica is bringing Leo over, and Barbara wants the boy to have a traditional Christmas morning. Having the new wife hovering around the ex-wife is just going to make everything tense and weird for everyone." I crossed my arms, feeling the chill of the hardwood floor through my socks. "So your mother invited your ex-wife to the family holiday dinner, and your solution is to banish your actual wife from the house?" Carter rolled his eyes, picking up his watch from the dresser and strapping it onto his wrist. "Do not do that. Do not make this a massive dramatic issue. You know how Barbara is about family traditions? Monica is Leo's mother, which means she is always going to be tied to the family. You just need to be mature and step aside for a couple of days so my son can have a peaceful holiday." He walked past me into the kitchen, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the tile. I followed him, maintaining a carefully neutral expression. This was not the first time Carter had prioritized his mother's elitist demands, or Monica's comfort over my own. For 3 years of marriage, I had endured Barbara's constant, thinly veiled insults about my background. She loved to remind everyone that I grew up in the foster care system, while Monica came from a wealthy generational family that perfectly matched their own pedigree. Carter grabbed his expensive wool coat from the hall closet. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. It fluttered down and landed right next to the gingerbread cookies I had spent the entire morning baking. "Look," he said, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. "Just order yourself some Chinese takeout tonight. Pour a glass of wine, open your laptop, and catch up on your little spreadsheets. You are always complaining about being behind on your office work anyway. It will be a nice quiet night for you to be a corporate drone in peace. I will be back on the 26th. I stared at the $50 bill on the marble counter. My little spreadsheets. Carter was the vice president of sales at a mid-sized tech firm, a title he flaunted like a royal decree. He genuinely believed I was just a mid-level data entry clerk pushing papers at a boring financial institution. I had never bothered to correct his towering ego. He had no idea that I was actually a senior partner at one of the most ruthless private equity and distressed asset firms in the country. I dismantled failing corporations and liquidated their assets for a living. I literally bought and sold men exactly like him before my morning coffee. "Sure, Carter," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. "Have a great time with Monica and your mother." He did not even catch the icy undertone in my voice. He just smiled, a bright, arrogant flash of white teeth, and patted my cheek like I was a compliant pet. "Good girl. I will call you tomorrow if I get a free minute between opening presents with Leo." The headlights of his rideshare flashed through the front windows, casting long shadows across our living room walls. Carter grabbed his designer bag, opened the front door, and let the freezing Chicago wind whip through the house for a brief second before pulling the door shut behind him. The lock clicked into place, echoing loudly in the sudden absolute silence of the house. I did not cry. I did not throw things. I simply walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up the $50 bill, and tucked it into my pocket. Then I pulled my phone from my sweater and opened my banking application. For the past month, Carter had been acting increasingly erratic about our finances, insisting we move a massive portion of our savings into a new joint high-yield account. I had agreed playing the naive wife, but my instincts had been screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The app loaded, the screen refreshed, displaying the current available balance. $0. $150,000 was simply gone. My eyes went completely cold. I smiled to myself in the empty kitchen. Time to get to work. I stared at the blinking zero on my phone screen for exactly 3 seconds. I did not blink. I did not breathe. The sudden silence of the townhouse pressed against my ears, but inside my mind, gears were already grinding into overdrive. Carter thought I was catching up on spreadsheets. He was about to find out exactly what kind of spreadsheets I managed. I pulled up my secure contacts and pressed the speed dial for Victoria, my lead executive assistant and crisis manager. It was 5 in the afternoon on Christmas Eve. Any other boss would hesitate to call. I did not. Victoria answered on the first ring. Her background was noisy, the clinking of glasses and holiday jazz, but her voice was razor sharp. Melanie, tell me this is an emergency. I need a domestic wire trace right now, I said, pacing across the kitchen tile. $150,000 pulled from my personal joint account within the last 2 hours. I want to know exactly what bank it hit, what account number, and who signed the receiving ledger. The holiday jazz vanished, replaced by the sound of a closing door. You are tracking your own husband on Christmas Eve. I am tracking stolen assets, I corrected her, and I need it done faster than legally advisable. Victoria did not waste time asking questions about marital harmony. She had worked for me for 7 years. She knew that when my voice dropped to that particular register, someone was about to lose their livelihood. The banking grid is essentially locked down for the holiday. Victoria noted her keyboard already clacking in the background. Standard forensic sweeps will not get us past the preliminary routing numbers until the 26th. Do you want me to bypass standard compliance? Yes. Victoria paused the clacking, stopping for a fraction of a second. Are we deploying the hostile takeover protocols? The same framework we used during the Vanguard Tech acquisition last October. The Vanguard acquisition had been my masterpiece. A rival firm tried to hide their toxic assets in offshore accounts right before we finalized the buyout. I had authorized Victoria and our forensic accounting division to tear through their corporate veil, expose their fraud, and seize the company for pennies on the dollar. Carter, in his infinite arrogance, believed I was a mid-level employee who filed expense reports. He had no concept of the financial surveillance network I commanded at the push of a button. Activate the Vanguard protocols I ordered. Tear down whatever privacy walls you hit. If a bank manager gives you trouble, remind them who holds the debt on their commercial real estate portfolio. I want that money found. I will call you back in 10 minutes, Victoria said, and the line went dead. I walked over to the kitchen island and poured the rest of my lukewarm coffee down the sink. Outside the large bay windows, thick white snow was beginning to fall over the Chicago streets, dusting the street lamps and piling up on the hoods of parked cars. The city was settling into a peaceful, festive slumber. People were basting turkeys, wrapping last-minute gifts, and gathering around fireplaces with their loved ones. Carter probably thought I was sitting on the sofa right now, crying into a glass of cheap wine and feeling sorry for myself. He always assumed my quiet demeanor meant I was weak, that my refusal to engage in his petty arguments meant I lacked a spine. He mistook my silence for submission. In reality, I simply never wasted my energy on battles that did not matter. But this was not a petty argument over household chores or holiday plans. This was theft. This was an act of financial war. I walked into the living room and looked at the Christmas tree. Carter and I had decorated it together just 2 weeks ago. He had complained about the cost of the ornaments, insisting we needed to stick to a strict budget, because his tech company was tightening its belt. I had smiled and agreed, playing the supportive wife, while my personal portfolio generated more interest in a week than he made in an entire fiscal year. I kept my wealth hidden intentionally. In my world, money was blood in the water. I wanted a husband who loved me for me, not a parasite looking for a free ride. It turned out I had married a parasite anyway, just an incredibly stupid one. $150,000. It was a very specific amount. It was precisely half of the liquid cash we kept in that specific joint account. Carter was not a criminal mastermind. He was a salesman. He operated on ego and impulse. He likely thought taking exactly half would protect him legally if I noticed the missing funds before he returned. He thought he was playing a chess match against a beginner. He had no idea I owned the board. I moved to the hallway closet, pulled out my encrypted work laptop, and carried it to the heavy dining table. I bypassed the standard login and booted up my firm's proprietary secure network. Lines of glowing green data began scrolling rapidly across the pitch-black screen. I was no longer a discarded wife. I was now a predator. My phone buzzed violently against the polished mahogany table, shattering the quiet of the room. It had been exactly 8 minutes. Victoria was nothing if not terrifyingly efficient. I pressed the speaker button immediately. "Talk to me." It was not a simple bank transfer. Victoria said, her voice tight with professional tension. He did not move it to another personal account or a standard brokerage firm. He actually tried to hide it. "Where did the stolen funds land?" I asked, my fingers hovering over the laptop keyboard. "The money cleared through an automated clearinghouse and dropped straight into a business holding account," Victoria explained. "It was wired directly to an untraceable LLC shell company, registered in Delaware. Delaware, the premium tax haven for people who wanted to bury their assets and hide their identities." Carter was genuinely trying to be extremely clever. He truly thought a Delaware registration would make the owners completely anonymous. He foolishly thought the corporate shield was impenetrable. "What is the exact legal name of the shell company?" I demanded, opening my forensic tracing software and preparing to dig. "Blue Haven LLC," Victoria replied. I stared at the glowing screen, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of my mouth. The real hunt had officially begun. I bypassed the standard search protocols on my laptop and booted up a proprietary program our firm reserved for Tier 1 corporate espionage. Delaware prides itself on being a black box for shell companies. They guarantee absolute anonymity to anyone looking to hide their wealth from tax auditors, business rivals, or in my husband's case, their own spouse. To a normal divorce attorney, cracking a Delaware LLC would take months of subpoenas, court orders, and bureaucratic red tape. To me, it took exactly 4 keystrokes. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the public registry firewalls and tapping directly into the commercial banking syndicate nodes my firm controlled. I watched the screen as the software stripped away the layers of corporate protection Carter had paid some discount lawyer to set up. He really thought a basic privacy shield would keep me blind. The arrogance was almost laughable. The progress bar hit 100%, and a heavily redacted operating agreement materialized on my screen. I ran a quick decryption script, and the blacked-out lines faded into clear, readable text. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. "Blue Haven Limited Liability Company, Registered Agent Carter Davis, Co-founder and Managing Partner Monica Davis." I stared at Monica's name printed boldly on the digital document. My husband had not just stolen our life savings. He had legally bound those stolen funds to his ex-wife. They were listed as 50-50 equity partners in this fraudulent venture. A cold, metallic anger settled deep in my chest. Carter had always claimed Monica was a financial disaster, constantly telling me how he had to micromanage his alimony payments because she would blow it all on designer shoes and spa treatments. He used her supposed incompetence as an excuse to constantly interact with her, claiming he was just protecting his son's financial future. It was a brilliant lie. He was not protecting Leo. He was building a shadow life with the woman he claimed to despise, funded entirely by the money I had earned. I did not waste time feeling heartbroken. Heartbreak was for women who did not know how to fight back. I was a senior partner at a firm that liquidated multi-million-dollar conglomerates before breakfast. I needed to know exactly what Blue Haven was created to purchase. Shell companies rarely sat on liquid cash. They were vehicles for acquiring hard assets. I opened a secondary terminal window and ran a trace on the LLC's outgoing transactions. The system churned for a few seconds before spitting out a wire transfer confirmation. The entire $150,000 had sat in the Blue Haven account for less than 12 hours before being pushed out to a commercial escrow account. I ran the escrow routing number through our real estate database. The money had landed at Oak Brook Premier Brokerage. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I pulled up the multiple listing service and cross-referenced the escrow account with pending property transactions under Carter or Monica's name. A match flashed on the screen immediately. A property profile loaded, displaying high-resolution photographs of a massive, newly constructed luxury estate in one of the most exclusive suburbs outside of Chicago. 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a 3-car garage, and a sprawling backyard that backed up to a private country club golf course. The listing price was a staggering $1.2 million. I scrolled down to the transaction details, my eyes scanning the fine print of the pending contract. The $150,000 Carter had stolen from our joint account was not just a simple down payment. He had structured it as an irrevocable earnest money cash deposit. He had waived all contingencies, no inspection period, no financing clauses, no appraisal safety nets. It was an aggressive, incredibly stupid real estate tactic designed to force the sellers to accept their bid immediately. If the deal closed, Carter and Monica would be the proud owners of a multi-million-dollar suburban mansion. If the deal fell through for any reason whatsoever, the escrow funds would be completely forfeited to the seller. Carter had essentially trapped our money in a financial bear trap. He actually thought he had outsmarted me. He believed he could drain my savings, lock the cash into a real estate deal under a fake company, and then serve me with divorce papers while I was too confused to fight back. He probably planned to claim the missing money was lost in a bad stock market gamble, leaving me with nothing while he played house with Monica and Leo in the suburbs. I picked up my phone, dialing Victoria's private line again. She picked up immediately, her tone entirely focused. I found the asset, I said, staring at the glossy photos of the kitchen Carter was buying for Monica. It is a $1.2 million residential property in Oak Brook. The stolen cash is sitting in an escrow account managed by Oak Brook Premier Brokerage. I need you to pull the entire financial profile on that brokerage right now. Give me 30 seconds, Victoria replied. The sound of rapid typing filled the line. Okay, I have their corporate profile. They are a mid-sized firm, heavily overleveraged. They took a massive hit during the commercial real estate slump last quarter. They are currently staying afloat through a series of high-interest mezzanine loans. Who holds their primary debt? I asked, already knowing the answer before she spoke. Victoria paused, a dark chuckle escaping her lips. We do. Our firm bought their debt portfolio bundled in a distressed asset package 3 weeks ago. We technically own the paper on their entire operation. Perfect. I murmured, a genuine smile finally breaking through my cold fury. Draft the paperwork for an immediate debt call. We are going to seize their assets. Before Victoria could respond, my cell phone vibrated violently against my palm. A loud, obnoxious ringtone pierced the quiet of my dining room. I pulled the device away from my ear and glanced at the incoming caller identification. It was not Carter. It was a FaceTime request. The name flashing across the bright digital screen belonged to the one person I despised even more than my thieving husband. It was Barbara. My mother-in-law was calling me on Christmas Eve. The video connected, filling my screen with the glaring golden light of Barbara's massive stone fireplace. Barbara's face completely filled the foreground. Her features were perfectly lifted, her silver hair meticulously styled, and a heavy diamond pendant glittered at her throat. She wore a look of feigned surprise, her meticulously painted eyebrows shooting up as if my face on her screen was a complete accident. "Oh my goodness," Barbara said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Melanie, I was trying to call my sister in Palm Beach. These new smartphones are so confusing for me. I must have hit the wrong contact. She made no effort to end the call. Instead, she deliberately adjusted the angle of her phone. She moved the camera away from her own face to frame the scene unfolding in the center of her extravagant living room. There was Carter, my husband. He was comfortably sitting on a plush leather sofa, wearing a thick burgundy sweater, a glass of dark red wine resting casually in his hand, and beside him, practically draped over his shoulder, was Monica. His ex-wife looked radiant in a silk holiday dress, laughing brightly at something Carter had just whispered in her ear. Between them, on the thick Persian rug, 8-year-old Leo was eagerly tearing the wrapping paper off a massive pile of presents. A bottle of vintage Bordeaux rested on the mahogany coffee table. It was a picture of absolute domestic bliss, a flawless, wealthy family, enjoying their holiday exactly the way Barbara had always wanted it, without me. Look at them. Barbara sighed into the microphone, not even trying to hide the immense satisfaction in her tone. They just look so natural together, do they not? Like no time has passed at all. I am sure you understand why we needed this tonight. Melanie, Leo just needs a real family around him. He needs consistency. I watched the screen. Carter lifted his wineglass and clinked it against Monica's. He did not look at the camera. He did not care that his mother was broadcasting his betrayal directly into my home. It is about foundation, Melanie. Barbara continued, her voice hardening. Dropping the polite facade completely, people with the right pedigree understand how to maintain these bonds. Carter and Monica come from the same world. They share the same bloodlines, the same social circles, the same inherent understanding of what it takes to build a legacy. You simply cannot manufacture that kind of class. You cannot learn it. You are either born into it or you are not. I kept my eyes locked on the screen, my breathing slow and measured. Barbara was going for the kill. You have done reasonably well for yourself considering where you started. Barbara said, her tone laced with pure venom. But you have to admit, you never quite fit into our world. A girl pulled from the foster system bounced from house to house with her belongings in garbage bags. You lack the foundation for this kind of life. Carter tried his best to elevate you, to give you a respectable name. But water always seeks its own level. He belongs here with his real family. You belong exactly where you are right now. Alone. The words were meant to break me. 10 years ago. They might have. 10 years ago. The reminder of my traumatic past, the nights spent shivering in strange beds. The absolute lack of a safety net would have sent me spiraling into panic. But Barbara did not understand how foster care had forged me. It had not made me weak. It had burned away my capacity for fear. While Carter grew up padded by trust funds and nepotism, I grew up learning how to read the room, how to identify weaknesses, and how to survive when everyone else wanted me to fail. My lack of pedigree was not a handicap. It was my greatest advantage. It made me hungry. It made me lethal. And right now I was looking at a room full of soft, entitled people who had no idea they were already bleeding out. I did not raise my voice. I did not give Barbara the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply leaned closer to my phone, ensuring the lighting caught the absolute calm in my eyes. It looks like a beautiful evening, Barbara, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. I am so glad Carter and Monica are enjoying themselves. You are absolutely right about foundation. It is everything. If the foundation is weak, the whole house collapses. Barbara frowned slightly, clearly unsettled by my lack of distress. Enjoy the vintage red wine, I added softly. Merry Christmas to you all. I pressed the red button and ended the call. The screen went black, casting my reflection in the dark glass. I set the phone face down on the dining table. The silence of my home wrapped around me again, but it did not feel lonely. It honestly felt exactly like a war room. I pulled my encrypted laptop toward me. I slowly flipped the screen open. The severe glare of the forensic accounting software illuminated my face. In the dark, I cracked my knuckles, letting my hands hover over the keyboard. It is time to go to work. The blue light of the high-resolution monitor washed over my face. I brought up the secure global communication interface. Christmas Eve in Chicago meant it was already Christmas morning in London, but in Tokyo and Dubai, the massive financial markets were wide awake and hungry. I dialed into the heavily encrypted conference bridge connecting me to my senior partners operating out of our Asian and Middle Eastern bureaus. I did not need basic banking hours in the United States. Wealth at this extreme altitude operates on a borderless, entirely sleepless grid. 3 digital squares popped onto my screen. Kenneth from Dubai, Sato from Tokyo, and Marcus, who was currently flying in a private jet over the Pacific Ocean. They looked incredibly expectant. I did not waste time with standard holiday greetings. Pull up the detailed dossier on Carter's firm. I commanded, my voice echoing slightly in the cold, empty dining room. Horizon Tech Industries. Pull up their entire corporate debt structure. I heard the rapid, synchronized clicking of keyboards across 3 different international time zones. Marcus was the first to speak. His tone was strictly business, totally devoid of the polite hesitation a lesser executive might show when discussing a senior partner's spouse. "We hold exactly 70% of Horizon Tech's mezzanine debt," Marcus confirmed, reading the glowing data on his end. "We acquired the paper quietly 6 months ago when they utterly failed to secure their Series C funding round. They have been severely breaching their liquidity covenants for 12 consecutive weeks. The panicked board has been begging us for a restructuring extension. I had intentionally orchestrated that precise debt acquisition." Carter had spent the last year constantly bragging about his lucrative vice president of sales title, completely oblivious to the disastrous fact that his precious company was bleeding cash rapidly. I had originally bought Horizon's debt to protect him. I had planned to quietly stabilize the failing firm from the shadows, ensuring his fragile ego remained perfectly intact while secretly securing our financial future together. I had held the aggressive execution protocols at bay out of a misplaced, foolish sense of marital loyalty. I had literally paid millions to keep the ground beneath his feet from crumbling. And he repaid that absolute loyalty by stealing my cash to buy a suburban mansion for the awful woman he claimed ruined his life. Marital loyalty was officially a dead asset. "Initiate the debt-to-equity swap immediately," I told the screen. "Execute the default clauses on all of their outstanding loans. I want total control today." Sato leaned closer to his camera, his eyes narrowing slightly. "A forced swap of this massive magnitude will trigger a complete hostile takeover," he warned softly. "Horizon's current executive board will be dissolved entirely. We will instantly hold 85% of their voting shares." "Are you authorizing a total liquidation?" I stared at the screen, my reflection superimposed over the video feed. "I am authorizing a complete hostile acquisition," I replied. The digital gears of high finance began to grind. I watched real-time data flow across my secondary monitor as Kenneth and Sato executed the commands. Legal notices were automatically generated and transmitted to the registered agents of Horizon Tech Industries. Automated clearinghouses processed the contractual leverage instantly, converting millions of dollars of bad corporate debt into overwhelming equity control. In less than 4 minutes, a mid-sized tech firm valued at $30 million changed hands. The confirmation ping echoed from my laptop speakers. "The transfer is complete," Marcus announced, a hint of professional satisfaction in his voice. "We own Horizon Tech. The corporate veil has been pierced and the existing board has been officially notified of their immediate suspension. We control the assets, the intellectual property, and the entire employment roster." I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and precise. Carter had spent years telling me I did not understand how real business worked. He loved to lecture me about corporate hierarchies and sales projections over dinner. I pulled up the newly acquired employee database for Horizon. Carter's name sat proudly near the top of the organizational chart. Vice President of Sales. Base salary of $200,000 plus performance bonuses he never actually hit. He derived his entire identity from that title. He bought expensive suits to match it. He leased luxury cars to project the image it demanded. It was the absolute foundation of the endless arrogance that allowed him to look down on me. the justification he constantly used for treating me like a compliant, invisible piece of furniture in his grand, extremely important life. He honestly thought his job made him completely invincible, completely untouchable. I clicked on his digital profile. The interface offered a drop-down menu of administrative actions: transfer, demote, terminate. I did not hesitate for a single second. Authorize a massive corporate restructuring. I instructed the partners on the screen, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. We need to aggressively streamline operations and eliminate redundant executive overhead. Starting right now. I hovered my cursor over the termination command, watching the red button glow. I want the entire C-suite evaluated by next week. I continued, but we are definitely beginning the purge immediately. I took a deep breath and pressed the enter key. The system prompted me for a final authorization to sever the employment contract of Carter Davis. I smiled and clicked confirm. The screen flashed bright green, indicating the termination was legally binding and immediately effective. Carter's prized position was officially eliminated. An automated email was already bouncing through the secure servers headed straight for his personal phone, informing him that his building keycard was permanently deactivated. His corporate expense accounts were completely frozen, and his services were no longer required. I closed the employee database application and smiled at the dark, empty room. My arrogant, cheating husband was currently sipping vintage wine and laughing by a beautiful fireplace, completely unaware that he had just become totally unemployed. The hours between 5 in the afternoon and 1:15 in the morning passed in a state of absolute, unblinking clarity. I did not move from the heavy mahogany dining table. I did not turn on any additional lights in the townhouse. The only illumination came from the sharp blue glow of my encrypted laptop screen and the soft, intermittent flashing of the holiday lights strung around the Christmas tree in the living room. Outside, the Chicago snowstorm had intensified, burying the city streets under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. It was quiet. It was the kind of total, suffocating silence that usually precedes a catastrophic structural collapse. I poured myself a single glass of sparkling water, took a slow sip, and watched the digital clock in the upper right corner of my monitor tick forward. 1:14, 1:15. Right on cue, the absolute silence of the house was violently shattered. My phone vibrated intensely against the hard wood of the table, the screen lighting up to display a frantic, rapid succession of incoming calls. The caller identification flashed with his name. He had called 4 times in the last 60 seconds while I was in the kitchen getting water. This was the 5th attempt. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the mental image of him pacing the floors of the suburban mansion, sweating through his expensive cashmere sweater. On the 4th ring, I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply listened to the ragged, heavy breathing on the other end of the line. "Why did you do this to me?" Carter screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate panic that I had never heard from him before. He was not just angry. He was completely, utterly terrified. I leaned back in my chair, resting my free hand on the cool surface of the dining table. My voice, when I finally spoke, was perfectly level, devoid of any warmth or marital affection. "Do what, Carter?" I asked, keeping my tone lightly conversational. "Did you forget to pack your favorite silk tie?" "Do not play games with me, Melanie," he roared, the sound echoing harshly through the receiver. "Someone hacked my accounts. My cards are dead. Everything is frozen. You have to call the bank right now and tell them to lift the fraud alert. You are the primary on the joint checking. They will not listen to me. They told me my profile is flagged for critical review. Fix this right now." I took another slow sip of water. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Carter. The bank is merely following protocol when a massive sum of liquid cash vanishes into an obscure Delaware shell company on a major holiday weekend. It triggers certain automated security measures." There was a sudden, breathless pause on his end, the kind of silence that happens when a man realizes he has stepped on a landmine and is waiting for the inevitable detonation. "How do you know about Delaware?" he whispered, the panic in his voice giving way to a sickening dread. I ignored his question. It is 1:15 in the morning on Christmas Day, I noted calmly. What exactly were you trying to buy at this ridiculous hour that required you to use a frozen card? Did Barbara run out of vintage Bordeaux? He let out a ragged, desperate sound. I was not using the joint card, he confessed, the words tumbling out of him in a panicked rush. I was trying to use my corporate executive card. I was online. I was just trying to order a $15,000 diamond tennis necklace for Monica. A Christmas morning surprise. The payment gateway declined it. It said the account was permanently suspended. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man was breathtaking. He had stolen $150,000 of my hard-earned money to secure a luxury home for his ex-wife, and now he was attempting to use his corporate expense account to buy her high-end jewelry. He treated money like it was an infinite magical resource that required zero accountability. He had spent years lecturing me about fiscal responsibility while running a shadow life built entirely on theft and corporate fraud. Your corporate executive card was declined, I asked, allowing a tiny hint of mock sympathy to enter my voice. That is terribly inconvenient. Have you checked your work portal? Perhaps it is just a temporary server glitch. I did check my email. Carter shouted, the desperation returning in full force. That is why I am calling you. I logged into the Horizon Tech secure portal to see if the finance department had issued a global freeze for the holiday. But my login credentials failed. I had to bypass the main server and access my backup administrative inbox. There was a message waiting for me. An automated termination notice. I smiled in the dark room. And what did the notice say, Carter? He was breathing heavily now, practically hyperventilating into the phone. It said my position as Vice President of Sales has been permanently eliminated effective immediately. It said my severance package is entirely forfeited due to, and I quote, severe financial irregularities and massive breaches of corporate fiduciary duty. Melanie, they locked me out. They seized my shares. They took everything. Who is doing this? Is it Vanguard? Is it a hostile takeover? You work in data entry. You know people in finance. You have to tell me who is orchestrating this. His brain was desperately scrambling for a logical explanation. He still could not fathom that the quiet woman he treated like a housekeeper possessed the absolute power to dismantle his entire existence. He believed he was the victim of a faceless corporate raider. He had no idea the ruthless raider was currently sitting at his dining table. I took a slow breath and smiled. It is me. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. For a fleeting second, the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace burning behind him in Barbara's extravagant living room. Carter's brain was stalling, completely unable to process the 2 syllables I had just delivered. Then his predictable ego took over, violently rejecting a reality where his quiet, spreadsheet managing wife held any actual power. He suddenly let out a harsh, deeply mocking sound that was half scoff and half sneer. You think you did this? Are you completely insane, Melanie? Did you actually call my superiors and throw some kind of hysterical, jealous fit? He was pacing now. I could hear his heavy leather shoes thudding against his mother's hardwood floors. Oh my God, you did. You found out Monica was here and you have completely lost your mind. You called human resources, did you not? You made up some psychotic lie to get me suspended because you cannot handle the fact that my family prefers my ex-wife over you. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a moment, letting his frantic, pathetic accusations fill the quiet dining room. I walked away from my encrypted laptop and moved slowly toward the crystal decanter sitting on the mahogany bar cart in the corner. I picked up a heavy lead crystal tumbler. The heavy glass felt solid and incredibly grounding in my bare hand. I poured a generous measure of 20-year-old bourbon, the amber liquid splashing smoothly against the bottom of the glass. The rich, smoky scent filled the air between us. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The burn of the bourbon perfectly matched the ice in my veins. I did not call your boss Carter, I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and deadly calm. I did not need to call human resources. I certainly did not need to make up a psychotic lie. I am your boss. The heavy footsteps on the other end of the line stopped abruptly. There was absolute dead silence. Carter, your tech firm has been severely breaching its liquidity covenants for 12 consecutive weeks. You have been completely bleeding cash while you paraded around playing the big corporate executive. My private equity firm bought your distressed mezzanine debt 6 months ago. Tonight, we initiated an aggressive debt-to-equity swap. We legally seized majority control of your sinking ship of a company. I authorized a total corporate restructuring. You were not suspended by human resources, Carter. I personally eliminated your position. You are completely officially unemployed. The silence stretched out thick and heavy. I could vividly picture his face, the arrogant smirk melting away, completely replaced by the crushing weight of absolute ruin. He was trying to find a hole in my logic, a reason to call me a liar. But he knew the financial trouble his company was in. He knew the rumors of a hostile takeover. Melanie. He started, his voice suddenly small, shaking with a new kind of terror. This is a joke. This is a sick, twisted holiday joke. You push papers at a mid-level financial institution. You do not run a private equity firm. You do not buy corporate debt. I took another sip of bourbon, savoring the taste. Look at your automated termination notice again, Carter. Look at the authorized digital signature at the very bottom of the severance forfeiture clause. Look at the name of the managing partner who just seized your shares and locked you out of your building. I heard the rustling of fabric, the desperate tapping of a phone screen. Then a sharp, ragged gasp. He saw it. My name sitting at the top of the food chain, dismantling his entire professional identity with a single stroke. I expected him to break. I expected the apologies to start flowing. The desperate begging, the sudden realization that he had drastically underestimated the woman he married. I waited for the pleading, but I had forgotten the sheer impenetrable depth of Carter's narcissism. A cornered rat does not apologize. It bites. The heavy breathing on his end of the phone suddenly stopped. Then a low rumbling sound began in his chest. It grew louder, twisting into a harsh, manic laugh. He was actually laughing. It was a chaotic, unhinged sound that echoed terribly through the receiver. You think you won, Melanie? He spat, his voice vibrating with a sudden dark triumph. Do you think taking away my job makes you the winner here? You think I am going to beg you for mercy? I tightened my grip on the crystal tumbler, my eyes narrowing in the dark room. I did not expect you to beg, Carter. I expected you to finally understand exactly who you are dealing with. I do not care who you are, he fired back, his arrogance flaring up like a grease fire. You are nothing but a vindictive, cold foster kid playing dress-up in a corporate suit. You can take the stupid vice president title. You can take the office. I do not need it anymore. You think you left me with nothing. I am light years ahead of you. I set my glass down on the bar cart. The clink of crystal against glass echoed sharply. I actually have a backup plan. Carter sneered, his voice dropping into a cruel, triumphant whisper. I have $150,000 locked away in a secure, untraceable LLC. A company you cannot touch. A company you do not even know exists. I was going to wait until after the holidays, but since you want to play these games, I will tell you right now. Monica and I are closing on our dream house next week. A $1.2 million estate in the suburbs. I used the money to secure the property. We are building a real life together. A life with my son. I am leaving you, Melanie. Carter's words hung in the air, vibrating with a venomous kind of joy. He expected me to shatter. He expected the quiet wife to break down and beg him to stay. I heard his heavy breathing through the receiver, waiting for my sobs. I let the silence stretch, giving him enough rope to hang himself. Are you crying, Melanie? Carter asked, his voice dripping condescension. Is the reality finally setting in? You thought you could play corporate raider and ruin my career, but you forgot who you are dealing with. I am 10 steps ahead of you. He launched into a vicious tirade, eager to inflict maximum damage. You really thought you could trap me, he sneered. You honestly believed you held the power because you managed to scrape together some success. But you are still just a frightened foster kid desperate for a real family. I gave you a respectable name. I gave you a life you never could have achieved on your own. And how do you repay me with this pathetic, hysterical stunt? I am going to make you pay for this, Melanie. I am going to drag our divorce out for years. I will tie you up in endless litigation. I needed him to expose every single detail of his fraudulent backup plan. I forced my breathing to hitch, injecting a perfectly calibrated tremor into my voice. "Carter, please," I whispered, making myself sound small and terrified. "You cannot take that money. That is my capital. I earned that. You cannot just hide it from me." He let out a bark of triumphant laughter, intoxicated by his perceived dominance. The bait was set, and he swallowed it whole. "It is beyond the reach of any divorce attorney or forensic accountant you try to hire. It is a ghost." I gripped the edge of the mahogany table, keeping my voice shaky. "You set up a shell company, Carter, that is illegal. You cannot use marital assets to fund a secret life with Monica." "It is not a secret life anymore, is it?" he retorted, the cruelty radiating from the phone. "It is my actual life. The life I deserve. Monica understands legacy. She comes from the right background. She knows how to manage social capital, how to be a proper wife. You are just a placeholder, Melanie, a convenient bank account while I put my real family back together. And now I have everything I need. The Delaware company is pristine. The funds are already cleared. We have the down payment for the new estate. It is a magnificent property. 6 bedrooms, a massive backyard for Leo, a gourmet kitchen. It is everything we ever wanted." He was practically purring now, completely lost in his grand delusion. He thought he had outmaneuvered me on every front. "You are going to be left with absolutely nothing," Carter continued, his voice dropping into a harsh cadence. "I will file for spousal support. I will demand half of your firm's assets. I will claim that my corporate connections directly contributed to your financial success. I will drag your name through the mud in every social circle in this city. By the time my lawyers are done with you, you will be begging for a settlement just to make it stop. You overplayed your hand tonight. You tried to ruin my Christmas, but you only ended up destroying your own miserable life." I listened to the ice clinking in his glass again. He was likely standing in Barbara's living room, feeling like an absolute king. I let him savor the illusion for exactly 5 more seconds. I stood up from the dining chair. The false tremor vanished from my voice, instantly replaced by a cold, razor-sharp edge. "Are you finished, Carter?" I asked. The sudden shift in my tone made him falter. "What?" He snapped, the arrogance slipping slightly. "I asked if you were finished." I repeated, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet townhouse. "Because while you were busy bragging about your brilliant Delaware shell company, you forgot a very basic principle of real estate finance. You cannot simply buy a $1.2 million estate with a $150,000 down payment without securing a substantial mortgage for the remaining balance. A mortgage that requires rigorous underwriting, pristine credit, and verified ongoing executive income. Income that you no longer possess because you are officially unemployed." "My credit is flawless," Carter spat back, though a hint of uncertainty crept into his words. "The mortgage is already approved. The loan officer signed off on the underwriting 3 days ago. The closing is scheduled for Thursday morning. You cannot touch it. The paperwork is completely finalized." I walked over to the tall windows, looking out at the snow falling silently on the dark Chicago streets. "An approval is contingent on employment verification prior to funding Carter. A simple phone call to Human Resources will flag your immediate termination. The bank will pull the funding instantly, but that is not even the best part." "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his breathing growing shallow again. "Stop speaking in riddles, Melanie. You cannot stop the closing. We are signing the documents." "You might want to double-check who exactly owns the mortgage debt on that beautiful dream house, Carter," I said, letting the words fall like heavy stones. "My firm acquired that boutique lending portfolio last month. We hold the paper. Merry Christmas." I pressed the red button and disconnected the call. The rest of the night passed in total silence. I did not sleep. I did not need to. I sat by the window watching the Chicago snowstorm finally break just as the sun began to rise over the frozen city. The sky turned a piercing shade of winter blue. At 7:30, I walked into the kitchen and turned on my espresso machine. The rich aroma of roasted coffee beans filled the cold air. I poured the dark liquid into a small porcelain cup and walked back into the living room. I chose the leather armchair across from the entryway. I sat down, crossed my legs, and waited. I knew exactly how long it would take them to mobilize. At 8 o'clock, the screech of tires tore through the quiet street. Car doors slammed in rapid succession. Heavy footsteps thundered up my front walkway. They did not bother ringing the doorbell. The heavy oak front door was shoved open with such force that the brass handle struck the interior wall, leaving a deep dent. They poured into my foyer like a panicked army. Carter led the charge, his face a mottled, alarming shade of purple. The smug arrogance from his late-night phone call had completely evaporated. He was breathing heavily, his coat thrown hastily over rumpled clothes. Right behind him was Monica. She was clutching a handbag to her chest, her perfectly blown-out hair looking wind-blown. Her eyes were red-rimmed and darting around my living room, taking in my absolute stillness. Then came my mother-in-law, Barbara, radiating pure venom. She marched in, wearing a full-length cashmere coat, her jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. Rounding out the invasion force were Carter's sister Amanda and her husband Malcolm, both looking ready for a fight. They all froze for a fraction of a second when they saw me. I did not stand up. I did not offer them a holiday greeting. I simply raised my porcelain cup, took a slow sip of hot espresso, and stared back at them. "You crazy, vindictive witch!" Carter screamed, shattering the brief silence. He stormed forward, stopping short of my coffee table. "You think you can steal my life and sit there drinking coffee? You are going to fix this now, Melanie. You are going to call whoever you need to call and reverse this absolute insanity." Monica pushed past him, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" she shrieked, pointing at my face. "We were supposed to close on that house next week. I have contractors scheduled. I have designers waiting. You cannot take my home away from me. You have no right to do this to my son." Amanda chimed in, her voice shrill and grating. "This is exactly why Mom never liked you," she yelled. "You have no class. You do not understand how families operate. You are just a bitter, jealous woman throwing a tantrum because Carter finally realized he belongs with a woman of actual pedigree." "We are going to sue you for every penny you have," Malcolm added, puffing out his chest, trying to look intimidating. "This has to be illegal. You cannot just use insider trading to ruin a man's career. We are calling the authorities." I let their collective fury wash over me. It was a symphony of entitled panic. They were so accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted that facing a consequence completely short-circuited their brains. They yelled over each other, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, desperate chorus. Carter threatened to call the police. Monica wailed about her ruined Christmas morning. Amanda insulted my foster care background again, and Malcolm threatened endless litigation. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I just watched them. I watched the veins bulge in Carter's neck. I watched Monica's mascara run down her cheeks. I watched Amanda stamp her foot like a petulant child. It took them nearly 5 full minutes to realize I was not engaging. Their shouting slowly died down, sputtering into heavy breathing and glaring stares. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, echoing clearly in the sudden quiet of the living room. Carter lunged forward, but Barbara suddenly shot her arm out, stopping him in his tracks. My mother-in-law had been the only one completely silent during the entire outburst. She had simply stood near the doorway, observing me with cold, calculating eyes. Now she stepped forward, taking control of the room exactly as she always did. She walked slowly toward my armchair, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She unbuttoned her cashmere coat, reached into the inner pocket, and pulled out a thick, folded stack of legal documents. She did not yell. She did not lose her temper. She operated with the chilling efficiency of a woman who was used to crushing her opposition through sheer financial dominance. She stood over me and tossed the heavy stack of papers onto my glass coffee table. The resulting slap of paper against glass was loud in the silent room. "We are not playing games with you anymore, Melanie," Barbara said, her voice a low, dangerous rasp. "I do not care what kind of petty corporate leverage you think you have stumbled into. You are out of your depth. You are dealing with forces you cannot possibly comprehend or fight." I glanced down at the documents on the table, then back up at her cold, silver eyes. That is a comprehensive non-disclosure and settlement agreement, Barbara instructed. It states that you will immediately relinquish all corporate claims against Horizon Tech. It states you will immediately release the mortgage lien on Carter and Monica's new property. It also waives your right to any spousal support or marital assets. You walk away with the clothes on your back and nothing else. Sign this immediately, or we will destroy you. I leaned forward, placing my espresso cup on the mahogany coaster. The ceramic clink sounded sharp against the tension suffocating the room. I picked up the thick stack of papers Barbara had thrown down. The cover page was titled Post-Nuptial Asset Relinquishment and Marital Dissolution Agreement. I flipped through the first few pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon Carter had paid an unethical lawyer to draft over the holiday. It was an absolute masterpiece of delusional entitlement. By Clause 4, I was to immediately transfer 80% of my voting shares in my private equity firm into a blind trust controlled entirely by Carter. Furthermore, the deed to the house we were standing in was to be quit-claimed directly to him and Monica. I looked up from the document. Carter was standing behind his mother, his chest puffed out, drawing courage from Barbara's presence. He actually believed this piece of paper was a lethal weapon. "You see the reality of your situation now, Melanie," Carter said, stepping out from behind Barbara. "I had my legal team working all night. They uncovered every vulnerability in your firm's operating agreement. If you refuse to sign that post-nuptial agreement right now, I will file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. I will freeze all your assets. I will claim that your acquisition of my company was a breach of marital fiduciary duty. I will tell the courts you used our joint funds to orchestrate a hostile takeover to intentionally ruin my livelihood. Sign the paper and you get to walk away with a fraction of your dignity. Refuse and I will leave you completely bankrupt." Monica stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands resting on her hips. She looked around my living room, her eyes lingering on the custom crown molding and the expensive artwork I had painstakingly curated. "We are being generous," Monica added, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Carter could take everything, but we are willing to let you keep your little savings account if you just cooperate. We need this house, Melanie. The new estate will take at least 6 months to renovate to my standards. Carter and I need a proper place to live while the construction is happening. Leo needs stability. It is the least you can do after the stunt you pulled last night. You are going to pack your things today. We have a moving crew on standby. You can take your clothes and your personal items, but the furniture stays." I slowly lowered the document back onto the coffee table. The sheer audacity of their demands was breathtaking. They had marched into my home on Christmas morning, a home I owned outright, and demanded I hand over my life's work and my physical sanctuary to the man who had been cheating on me. Before I could even formulate a response to Monica's absurd demands, Amanda pushed her way to the front of the group. Her face was twisted into an ugly, resentful sneer. She had always hated me, always viewed me as an interloper who had somehow tricked her brilliant brother into marriage. "You owe my brother," Amanda screamed, her voice shrill and grating against my ears. "He gave you a respectable last name. Without him, you would still be a nobody. You were a pathetic, unwanted foster kid with no connections and no family. Carter brought you into high society. He introduced you to the right people. He taught you how to dress, how to speak, how to exist in a world you had no business entering. Every single ounce of success you have is because my brother allowed you to stand in his shadow. You should be down on your knees thanking him for giving you a life instead of trying to steal his money like a common thief." The echo of Amanda's words hung heavily in the air. A profound, crushing silence descended upon the living room. Barbara looked immensely satisfied by her daughter's outburst. Monica nodded in vigorous agreement. Carter stood tall, an arrogant smirk slowly returning to his face. They were a united front, an impenetrable wall of generational wealth and unearned superiority. They honestly believed their combined presence was enough to break my spirit. They thought the reminder of my painful past would shame me into compliance. They expected me to crumble, to cry, to reach for a pen and sign my entire life away just to escape their collective wrath. I did not cry, I did not flinch, I did not reach for a pen. I picked up my espresso cup, taking another slow, deliberate sip. The coffee had cooled slightly, but the bitter, dark roast grounded me perfectly. I let my eyes sweep across the hostile faces glaring down at me. Barbara's icy confidence, Carter's fragile ego, Monica's greedy anticipation, Amanda's venomous jealousy. They were entirely predictable, operating exactly as I had calculated they would. But my gaze did not stop on any of them. I bypassed the screaming sister, the arrogant husband, the entitled mistress, and the ruthless mother. I looked past their united front. I focused my attention entirely on the back of the room. Standing near the heavy oak door completely separated from the aggressive pack was Amanda's husband, Malcolm. He was an African-American corporate attorney who had built his own formidable career from the ground up before marrying into the chaotic, deeply entitled world of Barbara's family. Throughout the entire home invasion, the screaming and the dramatic throwing of legal documents, Malcolm had not uttered a single syllable. He stood with his arms tightly crossed over his chest. He was staring at the floor, shifting his weight uncomfortably from side to side. The look on his face was a complex mixture of profound embarrassment and quiet dread. He looked up slowly, sensing my steady gaze. Our eyes locked across the expanse of the living room. Malcolm knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly what I could do. The silence in the living room stretched into a suffocating tension. Carter and Amanda had exhausted their breath, standing with their chests heaving, waiting for my submission. Barbara maintained her icy glare, her hand still resting near the extortionate post-nuptial agreement she had tossed onto my coffee table. But my eyes never wavered from Malcolm. I watched the subtle swallow in his throat, the slight shift of his weight, the way his hands gripped his own forearms just a fraction too tight. He was a partner at a prestigious downtown law firm, a man who spent his days dissecting corporate fraud and defending executives against federal indictments. He possessed the intelligence that the rest of his in-laws sorely lacked. He recognized the profound danger of the situation. He knew that a woman who could quietly acquire a mezzanine debt portfolio and initiate a hostile takeover overnight did not operate without an airtight, devastating counter-strategy. I broke our eye contact and calmly set my espresso cup down beside the stack of legal threats Barbara had delivered. I leaned over to the small mahogany side table next to my armchair. Sitting perfectly aligned with the edge of the wood was a thick manila folder. Across the front cover, a bright red stamp read "Strictly Confidential." I picked it up. The heavy stock paper felt incredibly satisfying in my grip. Without rushing, I lifted the folder and let it drop directly over Carter's extortion document. The loud, definitive smack of the manila envelope hitting the glass table made Monica jump backward. The red stamp glared up at them, completely obscuring their pathetic demands. Carter lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He reached for the folder, desperate to maintain the illusion of control his mother had briefly established. "What is this trash, Melanie?" Carter barked, his fingers hovering over the red stamp. "Are you trying to counteroffer? Because I told you we are not negotiating. You sign the paper my mother gave you, or we freeze everything you own by tomorrow morning." I ignored him entirely. I did not even look at his outstretched hand. I turned my attention back to the back of the room, my voice cutting through Carter's bluster like a surgical blade. "Malcolm," I said, projecting my voice clearly across the room, "you are a brilliant corporate defense attorney. Your firm specifically handles federal financial crimes and complex asset forfeiture. Do me a favor and read page 4 of my folder." Amanda immediately spun around to face her husband, her eyes flashing with indignant fury. "Malcolm, do not move," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at him. "Do not engage with her. She is trying to play mind games. We are leaving as soon as Carter gets her signature on our documents." Barbara also turned her icy facade, showing its first hairline fracture. "Malcolm, stay out of this," she ordered, utilizing the same domineering tone she used to command her children. "This is a private marital dispute. We do not need your legal assessment of whatever fabricated garbage she printed out to save face." But Malcolm did not listen to his wife. He did not obey his mother-in-law. He kept his eyes locked on me. He saw the absolute terrifying calm in my posture. He saw the unblinking certainty of a predator that had already trapped its prey. As a man who made his living identifying federal felonies, his survival instincts were screaming at him to look inside that folder. "Carter," Malcolm said, his voice deep, resonating with a sudden commanding authority that startled the entire room. "Step back from the table. Do not touch that folder." Carter froze, his hands suspended in midair. "Excuse me," he fired back, turning to glare at his brother-in-law. "This is my house, Malcolm. This is my divorce. You do not give me orders." "It is actually her house," Malcolm corrected smoothly, taking his first step away from the front door. "And if she is offering us a look at her hand before she goes to war, you would be incredibly foolish to ignore it." Amanda stepped into his path, placing her hands flat against his chest. "Malcolm, what are you doing? You are supposed to be on our side. She is bluffing. Look at her. She is a nobody. She works in a cubicle. She does not have any real leverage." Malcolm gently but firmly grabbed Amanda's wrists and moved her hands away from his chest. "Amanda, please be quiet," he stated, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. "The woman sitting in that chair just executed a flawless debt-to-equity swap to seize a multi-million-dollar technology firm overnight. She is not a nobody, and she is absolutely not bluffing. Now step aside." The raw fear in Malcolm's voice finally silenced Amanda. She took a hesitant step backward, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Monica backed away from the table, clutching Carter's arm, her eyes darting nervously between Malcolm and the red-stamped folder. Even Barbara seemed momentarily paralyzed, her supreme confidence wavering as she watched her son-in-law bypass her authority. Malcolm stepped forward. His heavy leather shoes echoed in the large living room as he closed the distance. The entire family parted to let him through their previous aggression, suddenly entirely deflated by his grim demeanor. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating vent and the shallow, rapid breathing of my panicked ex-husband. Malcolm reached the coffee table. He looked down at the bright red stamp, his jaw tight. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and slowly retrieved his wire-rimmed reading glasses. He unfolded them with deliberate care, slipping them onto his face. He picked up the heavy manila folder, opened the cover, and flipped directly to page 4. He took a deep breath and began to read. Malcolm's eyes scanned the first few lines of page 4. Initially, his posture retained the rigid, defensive stance of a man caught in a domestic squabble. But as his gaze moved down the page, absorbing the dense columns of forensic accounting and the irrefutable bank routing numbers, a profound physical transformation occurred. The rigid defensive posture dissolved, replaced by the acute, terrifying focus of a seasoned litigator staring down a federal indictment. His jaw went completely slack. The rich brown of his complexion visibly paled, an ashen undertone creeping across his features as the sheer magnitude of the documentation registered in his brain. He was looking at a meticulously compiled dossier of financial felonies. Carter, unable to tolerate the shifting power dynamic, snapped. The silence was agonizing for his fragile ego. He took a heavy step forward, his hand shooting out to grab the thick manila folder from his brother-in-law. He loudly shouted that the documents were entirely fake, a desperate fabrication designed to scare them. He demanded Malcolm hand the folder over immediately so he could throw it in the fireplace. Malcolm did not even look up from the page. He simply shifted his weight, using his broad shoulders and taller frame to create an impenetrable physical barrier between Carter and the documents. When Carter tried to reach around him, Malcolm's left arm shot out his hand, slamming flat against Carter with enough force to halt the man entirely. Malcolm lowered the folder slightly. His voice dropped an entire octave, losing any trace of familial warmth. It was the voice he reserved for hostile witnesses on the stand. "Carter, shut your mouth, right now." Amanda gasped loudly, scandalized by her husband acting with physical aggression toward her brother. She took a step forward to defend Carter, but the terrifyingly blank look Malcolm shot her over the rim of his glasses stopped her completely dead. Barbara lost her icy demeanor instantly. She demanded to know what Malcolm was looking at, insisting that nothing in that folder could possibly override the legal leverage they held. Monica whimpered, shrinking further back flat against the wall, sensing that the guaranteed mansion and the luxurious future she had been promised were rapidly vaporizing. Malcolm ignored all of them. He turned back to the folder, his fingers moving rapidly as he flipped through the remaining pages. The sharp rustle of thick paper was the only sound in the living room. He read through the SWIFT codes, the offshore account routing data, the time-stamped logs of Carter's unauthorized transfers from my operating capital into the Delaware Shell Company. He saw the undeniable proof of marital asset dissipation, corporate embezzlement, and wire fraud. He saw the exact digital footprint Carter believed he had so brilliantly masked. Then Malcolm slowly glanced down at the glass coffee table, specifically at the post-nuptial agreement Barbara had so confidently thrown down. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. By demanding I sign over my remaining assets under the threat of exposing a fabricated breach of fiduciary duty, Carter and Barbara had just crossed the line from aggressive divorce tactics into documented, undeniable extortion. They had marched into my home and handed me the exact leverage I needed to put Carter in a federal penitentiary. I sat perfectly still in my large armchair holding my espresso cup, watching Malcolm process the devastation. He was the only person in the room equipped to understand the absolute slaughter I had prepared. Carter thought he was playing a game of family court chess. I had brought a tactical nuclear weapon. Malcolm understood that my acquisition of Horizon Tech was not just a revenge play. It was a strategic maneuver that granted me full, unrestricted access to the internal financial audits Carter had tried to bury. He saw exactly how I had traced the stolen capital from its origin point through the corporate accounts and straight into the holding company Carter intended to use to buy his dream estate with Monica. The paper trail was immaculate. Every signature, every authorization stamp, every digital handshake was meticulously cross-referenced. There was absolutely zero room for plausible deniability. Carter had unknowingly handed me the murder weapon the second he executed the final transfer of those funds. Furthermore, the folder contained sworn affidavits from 3 independent forensic auditors confirming the illicit nature of the transaction. The weight of the impending criminal charges hung heavy in the air, completely invisible to Carter, Amanda, Monica, and Barbara, yet blindingly obvious to the highly educated corporate defense attorney currently reviewing it. Malcolm finished reading the final addendum. He closed the manila folder slowly, the red strictly confidential stamp glaring under the living room lights. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses, folding them with precise mechanical movements, and slid them back into his breast pocket. He looked at Carter, a mixture of profound disgust and pity warring in his eyes. Carter was a dead man walking entirely oblivious to the executioner standing right beside him. Then Malcolm looked at his wife Amanda, shaking his head slightly, communicating without words that they needed to distance themselves from this catastrophic disaster immediately. The silence stretched again, thick and suffocating, as the rest of the family waited for Malcolm to declare the documents a meaningless bluff. Instead, Malcolm turned his full attention to me. The heavy, intimidating presence of the corporate defense attorney vanished, replaced by a mixture of absolute shock and profound professional respect. He recognized the checkmate. He knew there was absolutely no defense, no negotiation, and no way out for his arrogant brother-in-law. He took a very slow, deep breath. Malcolm cleared his throat, the dry sound echoing incredibly loud in the utterly quiet living room. He stared directly into my eyes, his expression conveying a startling level of fearful admiration for the flawless trap I had so carefully engineered over the past few months. "You tracked the wire transfer across state lines." "Yes, Malcolm," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I tracked every single cent. When Carter logged into our joint investment portal last Tuesday, he assumed I was too preoccupied with my firm's end-of-year reports to notice a sudden liquidation of our mutual funds. He routed the money through a holding company based in Nevada, thinking the corporate shield would obscure the final destination. But he used the same IP address he uses to log into our home security system. It took my forensic accounting team exactly 4 hours to trace the digital footprint directly to a real estate escrow account in Colorado. Barbara slammed her hand against the glass coffee table. The sharp crack echoed through the room, momentarily breaking the stunned silence. Her perfectly composed features had completely dissolved into a mask of furious confusion. "Malcolm, enough of this cryptic nonsense," Barbara commanded, her voice vibrating with authority. "What is in that file? Explain it to me right now. Tell me what fabricated garbage she is trying to use to intimidate my son." Malcolm did not flinch at his mother-in-law's tone. He simply turned away from me and faced Barbara. The quiet, uncomfortable man who had entered my home 30 minutes ago was entirely gone. In his place stood a veteran courtroom litigator who regularly dismantled corporate executives on the witness stand. His posture straightened, his shoulders squared, and his face hardened into a mask of pure professional detachment. He was no longer family. He was legal counsel assessing a rapidly sinking ship. "It is not fabricated, Barbara," Malcolm stated firmly, his deep voice ringing throughout the room with absolute, unwavering certainty. "It is a meticulously documented paper trail detailing the commission of a severe federal crime." Carter let out a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter, though the sound was completely hollow. He took a step toward Malcolm, waving his hand dismissively. "A federal crime. Are you insane? I moved some of my own money into a different account to protect it from a bitter, soon-to-be ex-wife. That is called asset management, Malcolm. Do not let her dramatic presentation fool you into thinking I did anything illegal. I am well within my rights to secure my financial future." Malcolm stared at Carter with a look of profound disgust. It was the look of a seasoned expert watching an amateur proudly explain how he had just strapped a bomb to his own chest. "You did not just move your personal money, Carter," Malcolm explained, speaking very slowly, as if addressing a particularly slow, stubborn child. "You intentionally executed an unauthorized withdrawal from a protected marital asset pool. You maliciously transferred exactly $150,000 of those joint funds. You did not just move it to another local bank branch down the street. You wired it across multiple state lines directly into a newly formed Nevada shell company. You then immediately funneled that exact same illicit sum from the Nevada holding company into an independent escrow account for a luxury residential property located in Colorado." Carter swallowed hard, the arrogant smirk finally slipping from his face. "So what? I bought a house. Big deal. Half that money was mine anyway." Carter transferred $150,000 of marital assets across state lines to a shell company to conceal it from a spouse. That is federal wire fraud. "It's a felony," Malcolm said, turning his gaze back to Barbara, ensuring she fully understood the absolute, unmitigated gravity of the current situation. The word felony hung in the ambient air, incredibly heavy and utterly suffocating. Amanda gasped loudly, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth as she stared at her older brother in absolute, unvarnished horror. Barbara physically staggered back half a step, her steely eyes darting frantically from Malcolm's grim face to Carter's pale, sweating features. The undeniable, brutal reality of the situation was violently crashing down upon all of them. They had walked in here this morning, expecting a quick bullying victory over a woman they considered entirely beneath their social standing. Instead, they were suddenly standing dead center in the devastating blast radius of a severe federal indictment that would completely destroy their pristine reputation. "He is exaggerating," Carter stammered, his voice rising in pitch as panic finally set in. "Malcolm is just trying to scare us. My lawyers told me I was completely protected. They said the Nevada LLC would create an impenetrable corporate veil. They promised me no one could trace the funds back to the joint account." "Your lawyers are either incompetent fools or you deliberately lied to them about where the seed money originated." Malcolm shot back, his tone absolutely ruthless. "The corporate veil is fully pierced, Carter. Melanie has the explicit wire confirmation numbers, the exact routing sequences, and the specific IP logs, placing you at the scene of the digital crime. The Department of Justice does not care about your petty divorce strategy or your feelings of entitlement. They only care that you utilized interstate telecommunications to actively facilitate the fraudulent concealment of financial assets." The minimum mandatory sentence for this specific tier of federal wire fraud starts at 5 full years in a federal penitentiary. You are not facing a messy family court divorce settlement anymore. You are facing a grand jury subpoena, asset forfeiture, and inevitable prison time. A single sharp, piercing wail suddenly shattered the incredibly tense atmosphere in the room. Monica pushed her way past Carter, her perfectly styled hair flying wildly around her face. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The smug confidence she had worn just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by the frantic desperation of a woman watching her stolen kingdom burn down to ash. She stepped frantically forward, her voice cracking under the intense emotional strain. Monica shrieks, "But the house is in my name! It's an irrevocable deposit!" Malcolm shakes his head, looking at the last page. Not anymore. Malcolm slowly removed his hand from the folder and took a step back, physically distancing himself from his wife's family. His professional assessment hung in the air, leaving Monica completely paralyzed. Her shrill proclamation about the house being in her name faded into a pathetic, breathless silence. She looked frantically from Malcolm to Carter, waiting for one of them to dispute the lawyer's terrifying conclusion. Carter simply stared at the glass table, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The reality of federal prison was actively rewiring his arrogant brain. I leaned forward in my armchair, resting my elbows on my knees, and clasped my hands together. It was time to deliver the final killing blow. "Malcolm is entirely correct, Monica," I said, ensuring my voice remained perfectly steady and conversational. "You see, you fundamentally misunderstand how high-level corporate finance actually works. You assumed that placing your name on a residential deed magically protected you from the consequences of Carter's financial crimes. You thought an irrevocable deposit meant the money was untouchable. That is how amateurs think. Real power does not care about the name on a piece of paper when the paper itself is owned by the bank." I stood up from my chair. The movement caused Amanda to flinch, but I ignored her. I walked slowly around the coffee table, stopping just a few feet away from where Carter and Monica stood trembling. When my forensic accounting team traced Carter's illicit wire transfer to that specific escrow account in Colorado, they also ran a comprehensive background check on the firm managing the transaction. I explained, holding Carter's terrified gaze. "The firm holding your supposedly untouchable deposit is called Apex Mountain Brokerage. They are a mid-sized regional outfit catering to luxury buyers. What you and Carter failed to realize is that Apex Mountain has been struggling with severe liquidity issues for the past 18 months. They were over-leveraged, desperate for cash, and actively seeking a corporate bailout to avoid filing for bankruptcy." I paused, letting the business reality sink into Carter's thick skull. He understood corporate acquisitions. He finally saw the trap closing around his throat. "I did not just buy your technology company, Carter," I stated, delivering the words with surgical precision. "I bought the entire distressed debt portfolio of Apex Mountain Brokerage at 3 o'clock this morning. I routed the acquisition through a subsidiary of my private equity firm. I am now the primary secured creditor for the entire brokerage. That means I own the paper on every single property they hold in escrow. I own the deed to Blue Haven. And because the initial funding used to secure that property was explicitly tied to documented interstate wire fraud, I seized the entire $150,000 deposit as a direct penalty for the fraudulent transaction." Monica let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her throat. "You cannot do that!" she cried out, her voice cracking with hysteria. "That is my house. We picked out the beautiful imported Italian tile. We hired the most expensive local contractors. You are stealing my home." "It was never your home, Monica," I corrected sharply. "It was a fraudulent crime scene purchased entirely with my stolen marital assets, and now it belongs to my corporate portfolio. I have already instructed the local authorities in Colorado to change the locks and issue a trespassing warning for both of you. If you step foot on that property, you will be arrested." Carter staggered backward as if I had physically struck him. He bumped hard into the expensive console table, sending a silver picture frame crashing to the hardwood floor. The loud shattering of glass mirrored the absolute destruction of his life. He looked at his hands, then at his mother, completely stripped of his unearned bravado. "I have nothing," Carter whispered, the terrifying realization finally breaking his spirit. "My company is gone. The house is gone. The money is gone. I am completely broke." He was right. I had systematically dismantled every single pillar of his stolen empire. He was facing mandatory federal prison time for wire fraud. He had no business to generate income, and his mistress was suddenly looking at him not as a wealthy provider, but as a destitute criminal liability. Monica backed away from Carter, her eyes darting toward the front door. The illusion of her rich, glamorous future had evaporated, leaving her tethered to a broke felon. She was already silently calculating her quickest escape route. The absolute devastation of Carter and Monica was a masterpiece of my own design. I had quietly endured years of Carter's infidelity, his gaslighting, and his condescending lectures about my foster care background. I had listened to Monica mock my marriage while sleeping in my bed. They deserved this total financial ruin. Amanda began to cry silently, stepping closer to Malcolm, seeking protection from the carnage. But Malcolm flatly refused to look at her, his posture radiating rigid disgust for the family he had married into. However, the battle was not entirely over. Barbara had been standing unnaturally still, watching her golden child collapse into a pathetic, whimpering mess. I expected her to crumble. I expected the matriarch of this toxic family to finally realize she was entirely outmatched and beg for mercy. I expected her to drag her ruined son out of my house to surrender. Instead, Barbara slowly lifted her chin. The shock that had temporarily paralyzed her features vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that was far more dangerous than Carter's loud aggression. She stepped deliberately over the shattered glass of the fallen picture frame, moving directly in front of her son to shield him. She slowly straightened the lapels of her expensive cashmere coat and fixed her icy silver eyes on me. Barbara was absolutely not broken. She was recalibrating her strategy. She adamantly refused to let a former foster child destroy her perfect family without a final fight. The frigid silence in my living room shattered the moment Barbara finally lost control. The icy, untouchable matriarch, who had spent her entire life ruling her family with passive-aggressive sneers and quiet financial threats, completely abandoned her sophisticated facade. Her face flushed a deep mottled crimson, the color spreading rapidly down her neck, clashing violently with her expensive pearls. She pointed a violently trembling index finger directly at my face, her wide silver eyes absolutely burning with a desperate, deeply unhinged fury. "You are truly nothing but a common thief!" Barbara screamed, her voice cracking under the immense strain of her sudden rage. The sheer volume of her outburst echoed sharply against the high ceilings of my home. "You manipulated my son. You tricked him into this marriage to steal his inheritance. And now you think you can simply walk away with our family assets? I will ruin you, Melanie. I will hire the best litigators in the country. I will drain my retirement savings to see you behind bars. I will drag this out in federal court until you are left begging on the streets where you belong." Amanda, completely revitalized by her mother's aggressive resurgence, stepped eagerly forward. She clapped her hands together, a twisted, victorious smile spreading across her face. She fed entirely off Barbara's toxic energy, using it as an excuse to unleash the vicious resentment she had harbored against me for years. "Yes, Mom, exactly," Amanda cheered, stepping over the shattered glass of the picture frame Carter had knocked down. "Do not let this ungrateful parasite intimidate us. Look at her sitting there like she actually belongs in a house like this. You are absolute trash, Melanie. You always have been. You were a pathetic, unwanted foster kid who got lucky, a street rat who latched onto our family pedigree because you have absolutely nothing of your own. You do not have the breeding or the stamina to fight a war against us. We have generational wealth. We have connections. We will absolutely crush you." Shh. Carter remained cowering slightly behind his mother's cashmere coat, but Amanda's cruel tirade seemed to inject a small dose of pathetic hope back into his posture. He puffed his chest out slightly, nodding along with his sister's insults, as if her screaming somehow magically negated the federal wire fraud charges hanging directly over his head. Monica stood frozen by the entryway, looking frantically between the screaming women and the front door, clearly terrified by the escalating madness, but unwilling to abandon the sinking ship just yet. I remained completely motionless in my armchair. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my background. For 10 years, their casual cruelty regarding my childhood in the foster system had been a sharp knife twisting in my ribs. They had constantly weaponized my lack of biological family, using it to enforce a hierarchy where I was permanently stationed at the bottom. But right now, their insults felt incredibly hollow. They were just desperate, meaningless noises echoing from people who were drowning in their own catastrophic consequences. I watched the veins bulge visibly in Barbara's neck. I watched Amanda spit with rage as she shouted. They were expending all their energy on a tantrum while I sat quietly holding the detonator to their entire existence. "Are you going to say something, or are you just going to sit there like a coward?" Amanda shrieked, taking another aggressive step toward my coffee table. "My mother is going to liquidate everything she has to destroy your pathetic little life. You have no idea what real money can do." I slowly uncrossed my stiff legs, smoothed out the fabric of my dark slacks, and sat forward, placing both of my hands firmly onto my own knees. The subtle shift in my posture was enough to make Amanda instantly freeze in her tracks. Malcolm, who had remained perfectly silent since reading the federal wire fraud evidence, took a very deliberate step away from his wife. He recognized the shift in my demeanor. He knew I was not retreating. "You have a fascinating perspective on wealth, Amanda," I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "You both speak so confidently about generational power and infinite legal resources. You genuinely believe that your mother's retirement portfolio is a bottomless war chest that can simply buy your way out of federal indictments and corporate takeovers." I turned my gaze away from the screaming sister and locked eyes directly with Barbara. The matriarch was breathing heavily, her chest heaving under her coat, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She was waiting for me to engage in a shouting match, hoping to drag me down into the chaotic mud where she currently stood. Instead of shouting, I casually reached my right hand into the deep pocket of my tailored trousers. The metallic chill of the small object rested perfectly against my fingertips. I withdrew my hand and slowly held it up for the entire room to see. Pinched between my thumb and forefinger was a small, sleek silver flash drive. It caught the light of the chandelier overhead, gleaming like a tiny lethal weapon in the tense atmosphere. Barbara stared at the small silver device, her eyes narrowing with sudden intense suspicion. The fiery redness in her cheeks began to recede, replaced by a sickly pale hue, as a new, entirely different kind of panic began to take root in her mind. She did not know what data that drive contained, but the absolute confidence radiating from my posture told her it was something catastrophic. I let out a long, quiet sigh, breaking the heavy silence that had suddenly blanketed the room. I tossed the small silver flash drive gently onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a soft metallic clatter right next to the red-stamped manila folder that had sealed Carter's fate forever in court. "Barbara, I was hoping you would not bring up your savings." I stepped from my armchair, moving with deliberate, unhurried steps toward the massive 85-inch smart television mounted on the far wall of the living room. The silence behind me was absolute heavy, with a suffocating dread that had effectively paralyzed the entire family. I picked up the small silver remote from the side table, synced the television to the input source, and calmly walked back to the glass coffee table. I picked up the small silver flash drive, letting it catch the light one last time, and plugged it directly into the hidden port on the media console. The massive screen flickered to life. I pressed a single button on the remote, opening the primary directory. Instantly, a brightly illuminated, highly detailed spreadsheet filled the entire display. Rows upon rows of financial data highlighted in aggressive red and yellow markers glared down at the room. Next to the spreadsheets were high-resolution scans of bank statements, wire transfer authorizations, and notarized deposit receipts. Carter let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He stumbled backward until his legs hit the edge of the sofa, collapsing onto the cushions like a marionette with its strings brutally severed. He knew exactly what was on that screen. He had foolishly believed his digital tracks were covered, relying on encrypted folders and password-protected offshore servers. He fundamentally underestimated the relentless surgical precision of a corporate audit team armed with unlimited resources and a mandate to destroy. "What is this?" Barbara demanded, her voice losing its commanding edge, replaced by a thin, reedy tremor of genuine fear. She squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the cascading columns of numbers. "Are these Carter's accounts? What are you trying to prove with this ridiculous display?" "Those are not just Carter's accounts, Barbara," I replied, pointing the remote toward the screen. "And this is not a ridiculous display. This is a comprehensive multi-year financial autopsy." I clicked the right arrow on the remote. The screen shifted, zooming in on a specific series of transactions originating from my primary corporate compensation portal. "Let me explain the mechanics of your son's brilliance." I continued, pacing slowly across the Persian rug. "For the last 3 years, my firm has awarded me massive executive performance bonuses. These were 7-figure payouts, vested stock options, and aggressive performance dividends that I earned through 80-hour work weeks and relentless dedication. Because Carter managed our primary joint accounts, he had direct administrative access to the initial routing destinations. He decided that my compensation was too substantial for me to notice a slight discrepancy, so he set up a shadow sweep account. Before my bonuses even hit our primary ledger, Carter's automated sweep siphoned off exactly 15% of the gross total. Amanda frowned, her brow furrowing as she stared at the television. "He took your money, but he is your husband. It is marital property. He is allowed to manage the finances. That is not a crime, Melanie." Malcolm let out a harsh, dry scoff, shaking his head at his wife's profound ignorance. He did not bother correcting her. He simply waited for me to deliver the killing blow. "Taking the money and hiding it in a shadow account was certainly a breach of fiduciary duty, Amanda," I explained, maintaining a tone of chilling politeness. "But that is merely grounds for a highly favorable divorce settlement. That alone does not put anyone behind bars. The federal crime, the absolute masterpiece of criminal stupidity, lies in what Carter actually did with those stolen funds after he siphoned them away from my knowledge." I clicked the remote a third time. The screen transitioned again. The left side displayed the outgoing wire transfers from Carter's illicit shadow account. The right side displayed the exact corresponding incoming deposits into a different, highly recognizable banking portfolio. Barbara gasped. It was a sharp, painful inhalation of air, as if all the oxygen had been suddenly sucked from the room. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her chest, clutching her expensive pearls, as she stared at the high-resolution scans of her own personal bank statements displayed for everyone to see. "You recognize those routing numbers, do you not, Barbara?" I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You should. They are yours." I walked closer to her, forcing her to look away from the screen and directly into my eyes. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. "Carter did not keep my money," I stated, the brutal truth ringing through the living room. "He systematically funneled a portion of my massive executive bonuses directly into your personal accounts. Every single month for 3 years, tens of thousands of dollars of my hard-earned compensation were quietly deposited into your portfolio. You did not question it. You did not ask where your son suddenly acquired the liquidity to fund your extravagant lifestyle. You simply spent my money." I turned back to the screen, clicking through a rapid succession of photographic evidence and corresponding receipts. "I tracked exactly where every single stolen dollar went," I announced, ensuring my voice commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. "I know that my money paid for your platinum-tier country club memberships. My stolen bonuses funded your bi-annual luxury vacations to the Amalfi Coast and your winter ski trips to Aspen. I paid for the complete architectural renovation of your incredibly massive South Wing. I funded your designer wardrobe, your expensive charity galas, and your ridiculous, pretentious socialite existence. You have spent 3 years looking down your nose at my foster care background, sneering at my lack of pedigree, while actively living like a parasite off the wealth I generated with my own 2 hands. You don't have savings, Barbara. You have stolen funds. You are an accessory to embezzlement. Do you still want to call those lawyers, or should I call the FBI? The acronym FBI hung in the air of my living room, like a physical weight, suffocating whatever remaining delusion Carter and Barbara clung to. While Carter stared blankly at the flash drive and Barbara tried to calculate a legal maneuver out of federal prison time, a completely different reaction unfolded near the entryway. Monica had been quiet during the financial autopsy, her eyes darting between the spreadsheets on the television and my demeanor. The sudden mention of federal investigators was the absolute limit of her tolerance. She had played the role of the mistress when Carter was showering her with stolen funds and promising a luxurious future in a Colorado mansion. Facing a federal indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement alongside a penniless felon was not part of her long-term life plan. The blood rushed out of her face, leaving her pale and trembling, but the fear morphed into something much sharper. Self-preservation took over. She stepped away from the door, her heels clicking against the floor, marching directly toward Carter with a look of venom. Carter looked up at her, a hopeful expression crossing his face. He believed she was coming to offer comfort, to stand by his side against my onslaught. He reached a trembling hand out toward her. Monica slapped his hand away with enough force to echo through the room. She looked him up and down, her lip curling in profound disgust. The facade of the adoring younger woman vanished, revealing a cold, calculating opportunist who had just realized she bet her future on a losing horse. She pointed a finger directly at his chest, her voice rising to a shrill, piercing pitch that made Amanda flinch. She told him he was a pathetic, broke liar. She demanded to know how he could be stupid enough to steal from a corporate executive and think he would never get caught. Carter tried to shush her, glancing nervously at me and Malcolm, begging her to calm down and desperately promising he would somehow fix it. Monica laughed, a harsh, grating sound entirely devoid of any humor or warmth. She screamed that there was absolutely nothing left to fix. He had no company, no money, no house, and very soon no freedom. She reminded him loudly that she gave up a lucrative modeling contract in Miami because he promised her a life of luxury and endless financial security. She had compromised her own youth and beauty for a man she thought was a powerful CEO, only to discover he was nothing but a glorified thief, living off his brilliant wife's success. Carter stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single coherent defense against her brutal, strictly accurate summary of his existence. He begged her to stay, pleading that they loved each other, that they could rebuild their lives somewhere else once the legal issues blew over. His utter desperation was physically repulsive to watch. Monica did not offer a single shred of sympathy. She simply shook her head, her eyes wide with frantic urgency, to permanently distance herself from the radioactive disaster he had instantly become. She declared unequivocally that she was not going down with his sinking ship. She turned on her heel, marching toward the plush armchair in the corner where her young son Leo had been quietly playing with a tablet, entirely oblivious to the adult carnage unfolding around him. She grabbed the boy roughly by the hand, hauling him to his feet with a sudden urgency that made the child whimper in protest. She grabbed her designer purse, slinging it over her shoulder as she dragged Leo toward the heavy front door. Carter took 2 desperate steps after her, his hand outstretched, his voice cracking horribly as he called her name. Monica stopped at the threshold, turning back one final time. Her eyes were completely dead, void of any warmth or affection they might have once shared during their stolen weekends. She looked directly at Carter and told him to never contact her or her son ever again. She explicitly stated that if he ever tried to reach out, she would personally testify against him to the FBI to secure her own immunity. With that final devastating threat, she pulled the heavy oak door open and marched out into the brisk morning air, slamming it shut behind her with a definitive echoing thud. The sound of the slamming door reverberated through the quiet living room, signaling the absolute end of Carter's pathetic romantic fantasy. He sank slowly onto the edge of the sofa, burying his face in his trembling hands, completely and utterly broken. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and deeply suffocating. Barbara stared at the spot where Monica had just stood, her mind clearly struggling to process the rapid total collapse of her family's carefully constructed empire. Her stolen funds were exposed, her golden son was a destitute criminal, and her own freedom was now highly questionable. But while Barbara retreated into panicked calculation and Carter descended into despair, Amanda went in the exact opposite direction. Her entire life had been defined by unearned superiority and petty cruelty, and watching her family get systematically dismantled by someone she considered inferior pushed her past the point of rational thought. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. She let out a guttural scream of absolute rage, completely losing whatever fragile grip she had on reality. She looked around the room wildly, her eyes darting for an outlet. Her gaze locked onto the heavy lead crystal vase resting on the console table behind the sofa. It was a massive, solid piece of decorative glass, easily weighing 10 pounds. Amanda lunged toward the table, her hands wrapping tightly around the thick crystal neck. She hoisted the heavy vase above her shoulder, her eyes wide and manic, locking directly onto me as she prepared to hurl the solid glass projectile straight at my head. Amanda's muscles coiled, her knuckles turning white around the thick neck of the lead crystal vase. Her eyes were wide, feral, and locked entirely on my face. She swung her right arm back forcefully, preparing to launch the solid glass directly at my skull. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to protect myself. I simply watched her perfectly still, letting her cement her physical assault charge in front of multiple witnesses. But the heavy crystal vase never left her hands. A sharp gasp tore from Amanda's throat as a large hand clamped down on her wrist with the crushing force of a steel vice. Malcolm, who had spent the morning in quiet observation, finally broke his silence. He moved with a brutal, entirely unexpected speed. He twisted her wrist downward, utilizing his leverage and body weight to neutralize her reckless attack. Amanda cried out in pain and shock, her fingers automatically opening. Malcolm caught the crystal vase before it could crash to the floor, slamming it down onto the console table with a resounding thud that rattled the picture frames. He did not let go of her wrist. He held her there firmly, his grip unyielding, his face just inches from hers. His facial expression was no longer the neutral mask of a compliant husband. It was a dangerous storm of absolute unconcealed fury. He shoved her arm away, roughly putting physical distance between them. Amanda stumbled backward, clutching her throbbing wrist, staring at her husband as if he had transformed into an alien creature. Her chest heaved rapidly, her face blotchy and dark red. For a fraction of a second, genuine confusion masked her escalating anger. Then the toxic entitlement flooded back, twice as potent as before. She stepped aggressively toward him, her voice a shrill, piercing shriek that clawed at the high ceilings of the living room. She demanded to know what he thought he was doing. She screamed that he was supposed to protect her, to legally defend this family against the common parasite sitting so calmly on their sofa. She pointed a trembling finger at me, shrieking that I was destroying her mother, ruining her brother, and humiliating their entire legacy. She ordered Malcolm to use his extensive legal connections to call his senior partners immediately to crush my absurd allegations and bury me in endless litigation. She reminded him loudly of his designated place in their social hierarchy. She told him he owed his entire luxurious lifestyle to the prestigious weight of her family name. She demanded blind loyalty, ignoring the terrifying federal evidence glowing on the television screen beside them. She wanted a white knight to miraculously save her from the consequences of her brother's actions, and she expected her husband to fall perfectly in line and draw his sword. Malcolm stood perfectly still, letting the massive wave of her hysterical demands wash over him. He slowly straightened his tailored jacket, adjusting his cuffs with a terrifying, methodical precision. When he finally looked at her again, his eyes were devoid of any previous affection. He looked at Amanda with profound, unadulterated contempt. He told her to shut her mouth immediately. The sheer volume and absolute authority in his booming voice made Amanda physically recoil in shock. It was a dominating tone he had never once used in the 10 years I had known them. He pointed directly at the illuminated spreadsheets, casting a harsh glow across the room. He asked her if she possessed the basic cognitive capacity to comprehend what those specific numbers actually meant. He gestured sharply toward Carter, who was still sobbing quietly into his hands, and toward Barbara, who was staring blankly at the floor in a state of catatonic denial. Malcolm explicitly laid out the grim reality of their situation. He stated factually that there was no legacy left to defend. He tore into the pathetic myth of their generational wealth, exposing it as a hollow, rotting facade that he had spent the last 5 years trying to prop up behind the scenes. He detailed his endless professional frustration. He shouted about the late-night phone calls begging him to fix Carter's incredibly sloppy legal contracts. He mentioned the countless times he had to leverage his professional reputation to cover for Barbara's severely delinquent country club dues and unpaid luxury credit lines. He unleashed a full decade of pent-up rage against their suffocating, unearned arrogance. He told Amanda she was delusional, living in a fragile fantasy world funded entirely by theft and sustained by a toxic sense of superiority. He validated my intelligence, stating clearly that my financial audit was airtight, irrefutable, and devastating. Malcolm took a slow, deliberate step toward his trembling wife. He lowered his voice considerably, making the quiet intensity of his words infinitely more menacing than his previous shouting. He told Amanda that her brother had not just stolen money from his wife. He explained that Carter had actively initiated fraudulent wire transfers across state lines, utilizing shared digital servers that indirectly linked back to Malcolm's corporate network. He made it crystal clear that Carter's staggering incompetence had inadvertently placed a massive federal target directly on Malcolm's back. He told her that federal prosecutors do not care about expensive country club memberships or high society pedigree. They care exclusively about paper trails, and Carter had left a neon-lit highway leading straight to a federal indictment. Malcolm refused to go down with their sinking ship. He had spent his entire adult life building his pristine career, and he would not sacrifice a single second of his freedom to shield a family of arrogant, thieving parasites from the severe justice they so richly deserved. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair, his movements sharp and undeniably final. Malcolm turned to Amanda, severing their partnership with absolute brutal clarity. I am not going to jail for your brother's felonies, and I am done covering for your family's incompetence. Amanda stared at Malcolm, her mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of shock. The crystal vase she had nearly hurled at my head sat on the console table, serving as a silent witness to her unhinged desperation. For a long moment, the only sound in the living room was the ragged breathing of my soon-to-be former in-laws. Amanda blinked rapidly, shaking her head to dislodge the words her husband had just spoken. She reached out her fingers, attempting to grasp his tailored jacket. She ordered him to stop making bad jokes, insisting his stress was making him hysterical. She demanded he apologize and strategize a legal defense. Malcolm recoiled as if she were carrying a disease. He smoothed the fabric of his sleeve, his expression radiating absolute disgust. He told her there was no strategy left to deploy. He stated clearly that her inability to grasp the severity of a federal wire fraud indictment was exactly why their marriage had been slowly dying for years. He turned his back on his wife entirely and directed his intense, furious gaze toward the matriarch of the family. Barbara was still clutching her pearls, her face pale, as she tried to maintain her aristocratic posture. Malcolm shattered that illusion instantly. He pointed at Barbara, his voice dropping into a dangerously quiet register that commanded the room. He told Barbara he was finished playing the grateful minority son-in-law. He outlined the subtle racism she had subjected him to since he first stepped into her home. He reminded her of the country club dinners where she proudly introduced him to her wealthy friends as a credit to his background, heavily implying he was an anomaly rather than an equal. He recounted the endless passive-aggressive comments she made about his family origins, contrasting his Ivy League law degree with her own generational prestige. He stated her pedigree was an illusion built on inherited arrogance and currently sustained by stolen corporate bonuses. He called her a hollow, bigoted woman who judged everyone by their bank accounts, yet possessed zero capability to generate her own wealth. Barbara opened her mouth to object, her face flushing crimson, but Malcolm cut her off. He did not give her a second to mount a defense. He shifted his attention to Carter. The former golden boy was still slumped on the sofa, looking incredibly small and entirely pathetic. Malcolm tore into him with the surgical precision of a seasoned prosecutor. He labeled Carter a financial parasite, a grown man who had spent his adult life leeching off the women around him. He revealed he had spent the last 3 years quietly intervening behind the scenes, using his legal expertise to fix Carter's incompetent business contracts. He told Carter he was a profound failure who lacked the basic intelligence to execute a simple deal, let alone a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. He stated that Carter's absolute stupidity had not only destroyed his own life, but had actively jeopardized Malcolm's pristine legal career by associating him with a federal crime. Carter shrank back into the sofa cushions, entirely unable to meet Malcolm's furious gaze. Malcolm turned his back on the ruined men and faced his wife one final time. Amanda was shaking violently, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face. She screamed at him, demanding to know how he could abandon her when she needed him the most. She shrieked that she was a partner in his firm, that her family name had opened doors for him, and that he owed her his absolute loyalty. Malcolm let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed against the high ceilings. He destroyed her grand illusion with brutal efficiency, telling Amanda she was the most unbearably entitled person he had ever met. He stated factually she contributed absolutely nothing to their marriage, their home, or society at large. He reminded her she spent her days shopping, gossiping, and looking down on people who actually worked for a living. He declared her family name was now officially a toxic liability, a brand synonymous with fraud, theft, and utter incompetence. He told her he had stayed in the marriage out of a misguided sense of obligation, but Carter's federal felonies had finally severed that thread. Malcolm reached into his suit jacket. He withdrew a thick folded legal document and dropped it unceremoniously onto the glass coffee table right next to the flash drive containing my explosive financial audit. He announced to the silent room that he was filing for divorce effective immediately. He stated the papers were already drawn up, his assets legally separated, and his attorneys would contact her by the end of the business day. He instructed Amanda to not bother returning to their downtown penthouse, as her belongings would be packed and shipped to her mother's house by the weekend. Amanda let out a devastated, piercing wail, her legs giving out completely. She collapsed onto the Persian rug, sobbing uncontrollably, as the reality of her sudden total ruin crashed over her. Malcolm did not offer her a single glance of pity. He turned away from the sobbing woman and looked directly at me. The anger vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of profound respect. He offered me a single slow nod, acknowledging my tactical brilliance and the absolute devastation I had expertly orchestrated. I returned the nod silently, accepting his departure from the battlefield. Malcolm turned and walked toward the front door. His footsteps were loud and steady, echoing through the foyer. He opened the heavy door and stepped out into the crisp morning air, shutting it firmly behind him. The perfect family was now decimated. Amanda was a weeping, broken mess on the rug. Barbara was sitting stiffly in her chair, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of federal prison loomed over her stolen fortune. Carter sat isolated on the sofa. I remained seated, perfectly calm, watching the catastrophic consequences of their arrogance consume them. The heavy thud of the front door shutting behind Malcolm left behind a suffocating vacuum. Amanda remained curled on the Persian rug, weeping with loud, gasping sobs of utter defeat. Barbara sat rigidly in her designer armchair, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths, searching for a non-existent escape hatch from her impending federal indictment. The crushing arrogance that had defined this family for decades had all evaporated. Carter remained frozen on the sofa. He stared at the empty space where his brother-in-law had just stood. He was entirely isolated. His mistress had abandoned him in disgust. His mother was paralyzed by her own imminent arrest. His sister had lost her marriage. His financial safety net was completely obliterated, replaced by a mountain of irrefutable evidence detailing his deliberate fraud. Slowly, Carter turned his head to look at me. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, watching the inevitable collapse of the man I had once mistakenly trusted. The last shred of Carter's manufactured dignity crumbled. His knees buckled beneath him, sliding off the edge of the plush sofa. He hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, humiliating thud. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging himself across the expensive rug until he was positioned directly at my feet. The golden boy of the prestigious family was now reduced to a weeping shell of a man. Tears streamed down his face. He reached his hands out, his fingers hovering inches from my knees, too terrified to actually make physical contact. "Melanie, please!" Carter choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have to listen to me. You have to understand what happened. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. I have always loved you. You are my wife. We took vows to protect each other." I looked down at him. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual affection. I felt nothing but a profound clinical indifference. Watching him sob on the floor was like observing a stranger overreacting to a minor inconvenience. For 10 years, I had tolerated his quiet dismissals, his subtle insults about my background, and his constant need to make me feel small so he could feel large. Seeing him groveling did not bring me joy. It simply confirmed exactly what I had finally realized. He was a deeply weak man. "Do not dare invoke our marriage vows." I stated, my voice as cold and hard as glacial ice. "You voided those vows the second you set up a shadow account to steal my compensation. You incinerated them the day you decided to move another woman into a house purchased with my stolen money." Carter shook his head frantically, fresh tears spilling over his cheeks. He clutched his hands together, bringing them to his chest in a desperate gesture of pleading. He realized his emotional appeals were failing, so he immediately pivoted to the only other tactic he knew. He began frantically passing the blame, throwing everyone he had ever cared about under the bus to save his own skin. "It was not my fault, Melanie, I swear to you," Carter sobbed, pointing a shaking finger toward the entryway where Monica had fled. "It was Monica. She manipulated me. She was a gold digger. She preyed on my stress. She constantly demanded expensive things, threatening to leave me if I did not buy her jewelry and promise her a mansion. She seduced me when I was vulnerable. I was just so confused and overwhelmed by work, she used me. I remained entirely impassive, letting him dig his grave deeper. When I did not respond, Carter shifted his target, aiming his desperate accusations directly at his hyperventilating mother. "And my mother," Carter continued, his voice rising in panic. "Look at her. She pressured me every single day. You know how she is, Melanie. She demanded that we maintain the family image. She forced me to pay for the architectural renovations on her wing because she said it was embarrassing to live in an outdated house. I was just trying to keep my family afloat. The pressure to succeed, to be the man of the house, it was destroying me. I made mistakes, but I was pushed into it." Barbara let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her face as her son brutally threw her to the federal wolves. But Carter did not even glance in her direction. He kept his eyes locked firmly on me, desperately searching my face for any sign of leniency or weakness that he could exploit. "I can fix this," Carter begged, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I will pay back every cent. I will sell my car. I will cash out my remaining stocks. We can go to counseling. We can start over. Just please, Melanie, do not give those files to the authorities. Do not send me to prison. I will do anything you want. Just give me one more chance." I looked down at the pathetic creature weeping on the floor. He believed that a few tears and a hollow apology could erase 3 years of systematic embezzlement and infidelity. He thought he could negotiate his way out of federal wire fraud, like he negotiated his way out of every other minor inconvenience. He had no concept of accountability. I slowly uncrossed my stiff legs. I reached into the side pocket of my tote bag resting on the floor. I did not break eye contact with Carter as my fingertips brushed against the crisp, heavy stock paper. I withdrew my hand, bringing the document into the light. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us, ensuring he could see exactly what I was holding. Without a single word, I placed the document onto the glass surface of the coffee table. I placed my fingertips on the sharp edge and deliberately slid it across the glass until it bumped very gently against Carter's visibly trembling hands. Carter stared down at the crisp white paper resting against his trembling fingertips. The heavy black font at the top spelled out his immediate future with ruthless clarity. It was an uncontested divorce agreement drafted meticulously by my own legal team weeks in advance. I watched his bloodshot eyes dart across the paragraphs, his panic intensifying with every legal clause he absorbed. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a judge delivering a final sentence. I explained the terms to him in plain, unmistakable English so there could be no convenient misunderstandings. He was going to sign away any and all legal claims to my house, my bank accounts, and my lucrative investments. He would officially waive his right to spousal support division of assets and future claims against my estate. He would walk out of my front door with nothing but the clothes currently on his back and the crushing weight of his own profound failures. If he refused, if he hesitated, or if he attempted to negotiate a single syllable of the contract, I would immediately transmit the digital audit files sitting on that flash drive directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I leaned back, interlacing my fingers. I told him he had a choice between leaving this house penniless or leaving it in federal handcuffs. A suffocating silence descended upon the living room, broken only by Carter and his uneven breathing. He looked up at me, his face a grotesque mask of sheer terror and utter defeat. He searched my eyes for any lingering trace of the compliant, desperate woman he had married 10 years ago. He found absolutely nothing. I was a fortress of ice completely impervious to his manipulative tears and hollow promises. He turned his head slowly, looking toward his mother for a rescue that would never arrive. Barbara was slumped in her chair, staring blankly at the wall, paralyzed by the horrific realization that her precious son was seconds away from destroying their entire lives. Amanda remained curled on the Persian rug, rocking back and forth in catatonic shock. There was no family left to save him. There was no legacy to shield him from the consequences of his own staggering incompetence. Carter reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the silver pen resting beside the document. His hand shook so violently that the pen rattled against the glass table. He pressed the tip to the paper. With a jagged, frantic motion, he scrawled his signature on the bottom line, legally erasing his existence from my life. He dropped the pen. It rolled off the table and landed on the rug with a soft thud. I pulled the signed document back across the table, inspecting the signature carefully before sliding it safely into my leather tote bag. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dress, towering over the broken man weeping at my feet. I checked the clock, standing in the corner of the foyer. I announced clearly to the room that they had exactly 10 minutes to vacate my property. I explicitly forbade them from going upstairs, from taking any bags, or from attempting to collect any personal items. If they were not off my porch in 600 seconds, I would call the police and have them forcefully removed for trespassing. The command triggered an immediate, pathetic scramble. Carter struggled to his feet, stumbling awkwardly, as he rushed to pull his hyperventilating mother out of her chair. Amanda hauled herself off the rug, her expensive makeup smeared across her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. They did not exchange a single word. The suffocating arrogance that had defined their entire existence had been completely stripped away. They moved like frightened animals, grabbing their expensive wool coats from the closet with uncoordinated, panicked movements. I stood in the center of the foyer, watching them shuffle toward the heavy oak door. Carter pulled it open, letting a blast of freezing air rush into the warm house. Outside, a heavy snow had begun to fall, coating the manicured lawns and the street in a thick layer of pristine white. The weather was a harsh, bitter mirror to their new reality. They stepped out onto the porch, shrinking into their coats against the biting wind. They were walking out into a freezing Christmas morning, entirely stripped of their stolen wealth, their hollow pride, and their shattered family unit. I stepped forward and firmly pushed the heavy oak door shut, the solid click of the deadbolt echoing with a beautiful ringing finality. I stood in the foyer for a long moment, simply absorbing the profound, magnificent silence that now filled my home. The toxic, suffocating presence of my former family was completely gone, scrubbed clean from my life. I walked purposefully into the kitchen, the hardwood floors cool and solid beneath my feet. I opened the wine fridge and retrieved a bottle of vintage champagne I had specifically reserved for this exact occasion. I popped the cork, the celebratory sound sharp and bright in the quiet house. I poured the bubbling golden liquid into a crystal flute, watching the delicate carbonation rise to the surface. As I picked up the glass, my phone vibrated softly on the marble island. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was a brief, unprompted text message from Malcolm. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a shared, unspoken victory. Brilliantly played. Merry Christmas. I smiled, a genuine, deeply satisfied expression that reached my eyes for the first time in years. I raised the crystal flute slightly in the air, offering a silent toast to the empty room, to Malcolm, and to my own newly reclaimed freedom. I took a slow, deep sip of the champagne, letting the cold flavor settle on my tongue. I walked toward the large bay windows in the living room, looking out at the falling snow, entirely ready to enjoy my perfect Christmas.